Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is Pro-Revenge Story. About 20 years ago, my property was part of a large farm. I bought it around 2004, long after the farm was broken up, but before there was any development near it. The piece of land I got was near the back entrance that joined into a dirt road that ran past. The more expensive plots were near the paved road in the front. I originally bought a large chunk of the land intending to do some hobby farming, but that never materialized. Around 2014, some of the owners got organized, I'll call them the Development Group, DG, and had the area designated as a municipal suburb. The municipality agreed to put in paved roads, water, and electricity if a certain percentage of the properties were developed. A construction company, closely linked to the DG, went around contacting owners who had land but no buildings, offering to build houses for us at a surprisingly reasonable price, contingent on them getting a minimum number of people to sign up. While this was happening, one of the DG members, Greg Thompson, approached me and offered to buy half of my property. "Look," he said, showing me some plans, "the area's about to boom. I can take this parcel off your hands for a good price and you'll still have plenty left to build on." I agreed, and the money I got for the sale, which was about 4 times what I'd paid for the entire chunk of land 10 years prior, combined with a small loan from the bank, gave me what I needed to pay for a house to be built, and it was a fairly large and nice house too. I stayed in the house for a few years, and my mom moved in with me. I had decided to subdivide the property again and build her a house next to mine, but unfortunately an undiagnosed tumor took her before the house could even be started. Well, it was diagnosed, but too late to do anything. "I'm sorry about your mom," Greg told me at the funeral. "She was a lovely woman." Soon after she died, we moved out of the house and started renting it out. About a few weeks before we moved out, Greg and the other DG members started talking about forming an HOA. I wasn't interested and left soon after. About 2 years later, Greg contacted me. "We need to talk about the entrance to the neighborhood," he said when he called. "There's an opportunity here for both of us." There were 2 roads entering the area these days. The original paved road that was near where the farmhouse had been and was entered from a fairly busy main road, and my dirt road back entrance, which was now a paved entrance from a wide but not very busy municipal road. The HOA was trying to get the old farm road blocked off to improve security and decrease through traffic, and wanted the road next to my property to be the main and only entrance to the HOA community, and they were pressuring me to join. "No way," I told Greg firmly. "I have no interest in having you people dictate what I can do with my property." "You're making a mistake," he said. "We're trying to build something special here." I said no, and I was adamant, and eventually they accepted that, but Greg called again a week later. "Look, we respect your decision, but we need a small favor," he explained. "We want to have a sign near the road welcoming people to the neighborhood, and the only practical place to put it is on the edge of your property. We also want to build a little guard hut and have a security guard permanently monitoring who goes in and comes out, and we'd like to build his shed on your property." We came to an agreement whereby they would mow the lawn and pay the equivalent of about $200 per month in exchange for the land they needed. I was very happy with this arrangement since the property was fairly large, and it didn't really cost them anything since they already had a full-time gardening service for the HOA. This all happened around 2017. They eventually got the other main road blocked off, and the HOA started paying for security to be permanently stationed close to my property, as well as mowing my lawn and paying me enough money for takeout for the family each month. I'm occasionally contacted by members of the HOA to get me to sign up, but I'm really not interested. My property has been rented to the same tenant, Dave Wilson, for all these years, and everything there is going well for me. Until about 2022, when someone scared the crap out of Dave's young daughter by making strange noises and firing a gun close to her bedroom window 3 or 4 times over about a month. "My daughter is terrified," Dave told me over the phone, his voice shaking. "She won't sleep in her own room anymore. We need to do something about this." This scared Dave, and I guessed it scared the HOA because they and Dave contacted me with a proposal. I joined the HOA, and they give me exclusions from the HOA rules, including exclusions from paying the monthly fees, and in addition, they will build a wall around the entire HOA neighborhood, including electric fencing and security cameras. They told me they had wanted to do this for a while, but were unwilling to build the wall on property that was not in the HOA. "This is a win-win," Greg insisted. "You get better security for your tenant, we get a complete perimeter, and you won't have to follow any of our rules or pay any fees." I couldn't see the downside, and so agreed. The dishonest dealings. It took a little over a year to build the wall and get everything completed, which is quite fast. And then, a month to the day after everything was done, Dave got an HOA warning about his dogs barking. He told the HOA that while the property was in the HOA, it was exempt from the rules. The HOA told him that they had canceled the exemptions and that he had 30 days to comply. He contacted me and I opened some mail I'd gotten from the HOA. I'd ignored it since I was supposed to be exempt from the rules and fees. "You need to see this," Dave said. "They're saying I have to get rid of my dogs or face daily fines. They claim your exemption is gone." Man, did I get a surprise. They had retroactively canceled the exemptions and were claiming that I pay late fees going back over a year, that the easement agreement had been canceled, and that they were retroactively canceling it a year back because the HOA contract allowed them to use small unused portions of HOA members' land for the common good for free, that I refund them the money they had paid for the easement over that period, that I owed them money for the garden service mowing the large lawn, and that I would be fined for each infraction my tenant failed to remedy. This started an expensive process involving lawyers and the court system that ended with a judge telling me that what the HOA had done was mostly legal. They had the right to revoke the exemptions, but that they had to give me 30 days notice. As I was walking to my car, Greg, who was now the HOA president, approached me with a smug smile. "You should have joined us when we first formed," he said. "You could have been a founding member. Next time, read the documents before you sign them." The malicious compliance. Greg was right. I should have read the contract better. Also, I was interested in what it meant to be a founding member. Spoiler, nothing. And so when I got home, I grabbed the HOA contract I'd signed, as well as all the other documentation they had provided me with, and started reading. I was determined to break every rule I could find a loophole to break. I didn't get past the first page. While the street address of the property is used to identify it for all practical purposes, in the city records, it has a unique property number that has to be used on legal records. When my mom moved in, I'd subdivided the remaining property but hadn't yet started building on it. And when I gave the HOA the easement all those years ago, it had been on the property I'd sliced off for my mom. And when the HOA set up the contract, they had simply used the property number from the easement. The next afternoon, Greg delivered, and had me sign for, 2 documents, one telling me that my exemptions would expire in 30 days, and one letting me know that the easement would no longer be required after 30 days. I think he was being a bit malicious here because I lived about an hour away from the property and he drove out himself. "I wanted to deliver these personally," he said with barely concealed satisfaction, "just to make sure there are no misunderstandings." The revenge, exactly 30 days to the hour. After the HOA had given me the 30 days notice, I knocked on Greg's door and had him sign for 2 documents. The first was that I planned to build a house on my HOA property, which confused him, and the second was notice that they had 30 days to remove from the property the guard shed, the parts of the electric boom that were on my property, as well as the sign. "What are you talking about?" he sputtered, looking at the papers. "You can't do this." I ignored him, climbed into my car, and drove off. Early the next morning, I got a call from the HOA lawyer who explained to me that their structures would be staying on my property since it was in an unused part of my land. "I'm afraid that won't work," I explained. "I'm building a house there, so the land won't be unused anymore." I could hear the smirk as he told me, "Building a second house just to be spiteful won't be accepted by the courts." I'm sure he could hear the smirk in my voice when I replied, "The property in question doesn't have a house on it yet and is barely large enough for a house to be built. There won't be room for any of your structures. I suggest you look up the property in question and call me back." I had sliced off just enough to be legal, which was just enough to build a small house. It took them just under 5 days to get back to me. Their lawyer told me that the terms of the easement meant that I could not cancel without their permission, so I emailed him a photo of the document they sent to me canceling the easement. That afternoon, Greg invited me to lunch, his treat, to discuss the problem. "We should talk this through like adults," he said. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand." "No thanks," I replied. He extended the offer again 2 days later, and again I said, "No thanks." Others of the original DG contacted me to try to talk. Some sounded aggressive, some sounded sympathetic. I said, "No thanks" to each of them. Eventually the lawyer phoned and asked if we could come to some sort of arrangement. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "We're prepared to discuss exemptions in exchange for access to your property," he said. So I said, "No thanks, and please don't call me again." About 9 days before their 30 days was up, I got a call from a different lawyer, Melissa Chen. "I've been asked to negotiate a surrender," she said. "Can we meet to discuss terms?" I agreed to meet her at her office the next day. I'd already had documents drawn up, and the meeting was as simple as me giving her the documents and her reading them over. My new easement offer included everything offered by the old easement offer. I changed the line "mow the lawn" to "get the property to HOA standards and keep it there," since it was now in the HOA. Would cost them $2,800 per month instead of $200. This amount would increase with inflation. The previous contract didn't include that bit. When canceled, for whatever reason, the HOA would have to pay me a cancellation fee of around $45,000. The contract automatically terminated 30 days after any disciplinary action was taken against me, my tenant, or the property. Any complaints were levied by the HOA against the property. Any legal action was taken against the property by anyone in the HOA. That Melissa would be allowed to mediate any disputes between us at the HOA's expense, and that the HOA would pay all my legal fees if any legal action was taken against me. I deliberately left some insane things in there so that I could appear to concede some points or be negotiated down when the HOA got indignant about the points I actually cared about. Melissa didn't look happy. "This proposal seems rather one-sided," she said cautiously, "but I'll have the HOA president review it." I reminded her that in 8 days I'd be setting a group of men armed with sledgehammers and anger management issues loose on whatever of theirs was still on my property. That evening I got an irate call from Greg. "This is extortion," he shouted. "I'm never going to sign this ridiculous contract." "Okay," I replied calmly. "You're charging an absurd amount per month. It should be the same as before." When I signed the previous contract, the area was under development, and there was at least one other road leading in and out, I pointed out. Now there's only mine, and it's fully developed with everything you need. "You're forcing us to sign a document we don't want to sign," he fumed. "You're free not to sign it," I told him. He whined about everything he could think of, and then eventually told me I'd be hearing from his lawyer. The next morning, Melissa called to ask if I'd be willing to come to their offices to sign the contract. "Greg has reviewed your terms," she said. "We'd like to finalize this today if possible." I agreed. When I got there that afternoon, I learned that Melissa was not a lawyer, but a paralegal. She handed me the contract and asked me to sign it. She laughed when I told her I'd have to read through it first to make sure nothing was changed, and mumbled something that sounded like, "I'm sure you would." I read the contract. Nothing had been changed, not a single thing, and Greg had signed it with Melissa signing as witness. "Why did he sign this?" I asked, incredulous. "It was stupid to sign it." Melissa looked at me and said, "I started telling him that signing it would be a bad decision, but he told me I wasn't being paid to think or give legal advice, and to shut up. So I shut up." "Do you understand what he signed here?" I asked. She nodded. "I asked him if I should have one of the lawyers look at it before giving it to you, and he told me that we had already billed enough for this and that he'd sign it and sue you after their easement was safe. This happened about 1.5 years ago. It took 6 months for the HOA to find out how screwed they were. They wanted to sue me, but their lawyers explained to them that there was no way to win. Even if the court sided with them, all they would get is the easement contract voided, and they did not think that the court would side with them. The lawyers were adamant about one thing. The HOA could not live with the HOA pays my legal fees if legal action was taken against me, since it didn't limit the people taking legal action against me to the HOA. As worded, the HOA would be forced to pay for my legal fees if anyone took legal action against me. "The contract is incredibly problematic," their senior lawyer explained during a meeting. "As written, if someone sues you for anything, even something completely unrelated to the HOA, we'd be on the hook for your legal costs. I'm prepared to find out, since the HOA would definitely be the ones taking action against me if they challenged it," I replied. I eventually signed an addendum to the contract that said that Greg would personally pay all my legal fees unless he held no position at all in the HOA, and that the HOA would pay all legal fees if the HOA took legal action against me. He resigned from the HOA at the end of that meeting. "You should not sign documents unless you understand what you're signing," I told him politely in front of everyone. He didn't look pleased. It came out during the mediation. You cannot imagine how happy the lawyers were that their paralegal was mediating. That without the ability to control access to the HOA neighborhood through the security boom, partially on my property, the HOA had become a gated community a number of years back, the HOA would be in breach of their own articles and would be dissolved. I also learned, should have been obvious to me, that all the security cameras were wired and all terminate in the guardhouse/guard shed. So basically, it was my way or the end of the HOA. That first mediation was really quite funny. Melissa looked more than a little glum as we assembled, and she called everyone to order. I suspected that she had been told to work against me, so I took the initiative. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to remind everyone that I agreed to let Melissa mediate, but I never agreed to any arbitration. If I feel these proceedings aren't fair, I'll leave, and you can go ahead and sue me if you want." Melissa brightened up, and things actually went quite well. I'm writing this after getting home from the latest mediation. I built a paddling pool for the neighborhood dogs, as in I made it myself. I dug a hole, packed it with stone, and added a concrete finish. It was my first attempt, and if I say so myself, it looked, well, terrible. The HOA called for a mediation meeting, what they do now instead of taking official action. I've declined their mediation requests in the past, in which they told me, as nicely as they could, that the paddling pool was an eyesore right at the entrance of the HOA. "We appreciate your initiative," said the new HOA president, Lisa, "but the aesthetic quality is concerning." I asked them to create a list of what needed to be fixed and how it needed to be fixed to give to me at the next meeting. The list was extensive. It basically required the pool to be rebuilt from scratch. "Is there any way to reduce costs on the work needed to get it up to HOA standards?" I asked innocently. "I'm afraid not," Lisa replied. "These are our minimum standards for community features." I thanked them, pulled out a copy of the agreement where they had agreed to get the property to HOA standards, which I'd highlighted, and handed it to them with the list. "The HOA usually prefers if these things are dealt with within 30 days, I said with a smile. They started arguing until Melissa reminded them that they could not force me to comply without causing the easement to end. I should mention that their lawyers usually no longer attend these things. "We'll get it done," Lisa said through gritted teeth. I also learned a lot about Greg today. I found out that Greg sold his property about 3 months back and is apparently leaving the country for Australia. I found out that the HOA had successfully sued him for a significant amount of money they had lost due to his mismanagement as part of his vendetta against me. Greg's actions cost this community nearly $100,000, Lisa admitted. "We had no choice but to take legal action." I also learned that he had a vendetta against me. I have no idea what I did to upset him. "He was convinced you were deliberately trying to undermine the community," Lisa explained. "He took it all very personally. I'm not sure if I will mess with the HOA anymore. I already think I'm so close to breaking them, the only thing stopping them from canceling the contract is the massive financial loss if they do. I guess a lot depends on how they treat me and Dave going forward. Also, I do like the monthly payments though, so I'm motivated to play nice." The next one is an entitled people story. Let me tell you about the most satisfying case of malicious compliance I've ever pulled off, involving an overzealous HOA that forgot the most basic rule about property lines. I inherited my grandfather's property about 5 years ago. 43 acres of beautiful rural land, complete with a century-old farmhouse and a massive red barn that's seen better days, but still stands proud. The property has been in my family for 3 generations, and it sits on what used to be the outskirts of town. Used to be, anyway. About 2 years after I moved in, developers swooped in and bought up all the surrounding farmland. Within 18 months, they'd erected one of those cookie-cutter suburban developments right up to my eastern property line. McMansions with perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and enough HOA rules to choke a horse. The Willowbrook Estates, they called it, complete with a fancy stone entrance and everything. At first, the new neighbors were friendly enough. A few even stopped by to introduce themselves and admire the old barn. I didn't mind the development. More power to them if they wanted to live under HOA restrictions. My property was clearly established decades before their little kingdom existed, and I had the survey stakes and property records to prove it. The problem started about 6 months after the last house was built. I was working in my garden one Saturday morning when I noticed a white golf cart puttering around my property line. 2 middle-aged people in matching polo shirts were taking pictures of my barn and scribbling notes on clipboards. They had official-looking badges hanging around their necks. I wandered over to see what was going on. The man, probably in his 50s with the kind of mustache that screams "I take myself very seriously," informed me they were conducting a community standards assessment. The woman next to him nodded grimly while continuing to photograph my barn from every angle. I explained politely that my property wasn't part of their HOA, but they just exchanged glances and told me they'd look into it. They drove away, but something about their dismissive attitude rubbed me wrong. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find that same golf cart parked in my driveway. This time, they weren't just taking pictures from the property line, they were inside my barn, poking around my equipment and tools like they owned the place. I was furious. These people had not only trespassed on my property, they'd entered my barn without permission. When I confronted them, the mustached man, who I later learned was the HOA enforcement coordinator, had the audacity to tell me they were conducting their inspection and would be filing a report. I told them to get off my property immediately. The woman, clipboard still in hand, informed me in the most condescending tone possible that they had every right to inspect properties for violations of community standards. When I pointed out again that I wasn't part of their HOA, she rolled her eyes and said that was impossible because my property was clearly within their jurisdiction. The next week, I received a certified letter that made my blood boil. It was an official notice of violation from the Willowbrook Estates HOA, listing a dozen supposed infractions on my property. According to them, my barn was an eyesore that violated their architectural standards, my vegetable garden was inappropriate landscaping, and my gravel driveway needed to be paved with approved materials. The letter demanded I remedy these violations within 30 days or face escalating fines. It was signed by someone calling themselves the Architectural Review Board and included a helpful list of approved contractors who could bring my property into compliance. I called the HOA office thinking surely this was some kind of mistake. The conversation went about as well as you'd expect. The office manager, speaking to me like I was a particularly slow child, explained that all properties in the area fell under their jurisdiction and I needed to comply with their rules. When I insisted my property predated their development and wasn't subject to their authority, she sighed heavily and said they'd send someone out to educate me about my responsibilities. That someone turned out to be the enforcement coordinator again, this time accompanied by what he proudly introduced as the HOA board president. A woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a suburban nightmare, complete with a massive SUV and an even bigger attitude. They parked right in front of my barn and started taking more pictures. When I came out to confront them again, the board president handed me another official-looking document. This one was even better, a mandatory compliance order giving me 14 days to paint my barn an approved neutral color, remove my vegetable garden, and pave my driveway. The kicker was the last line. Failure to comply will result in the HOA exercising its right to bring the property into compliance at the owner's expense. I tried explaining one more time that they had no authority over my property. I showed them my deed, my survey, my property tax records. Everything proving my land wasn't part of their development. They weren't interested. The board president actually laughed and said property records could be misleading, and that clearly my property fell within their community boundaries. That's when I realized these people were beyond reason. They'd convinced themselves they had authority they didn't possess, and no amount of documentation was going to change their minds. So I decided to take a different approach. I called my lawyer, not to sue them, but to make sure I understood exactly what they were claiming. He confirmed what I already knew. They had absolutely zero authority over my property. But he also explained something interesting about their compliance order. They'd essentially put in writing their intention to trespass and vandalize my property if I didn't comply with their demands. That gave me an idea. Instead of fighting them directly, I decided to give them exactly what they were asking for. Sort of. Their compliance order demanded I paint my barn an approved neutral color. Well, I'd been thinking about repainting it anyway, and beige was technically a neutral color, right? I spent the next weekend painting my barn the most aggressively beige color I could find. Not a pleasant, warm beige. I'm talking about the kind of institutional beige you see in government buildings and old hospitals, the color of bureaucratic despair. I made sure to paint the side facing their development extra thoroughly, but that wasn't the real malicious compliance. The real genius was in how I interpreted their demand to remove inappropriate landscaping. My vegetable garden was apparently inappropriate, so I removed it. All of it. Every tomato plant, every pepper, every carefully tended herb. I didn't replant it somewhere else. I removed it entirely, just like they demanded. Of course, I had to do something with all that rich, fertile soil and those thriving plants. It would be wasteful to just throw them away, so I decided to create a new garden right along my property line, exactly 1 foot inside my boundary. Not the vegetables, though. Those weren't appropriate, according to the HOA. Instead, I planted sunflowers, mammoth sunflowers to be specific, the kind that grow 12 feet tall with dinner plate-sized blooms. I planted them in 3 perfectly straight rows running the entire length of my eastern property line, the side facing the HOA development. Technically, sunflowers are decorative plants, not vegetables, so they couldn't complain about inappropriate landscaping. The HOA patrol came by to inspect my compliance about a week later. They seemed pleased with the beige barn and the absence of vegetables. They took pictures and made satisfied notes on their clipboards. They never even noticed the tiny sunflower seedlings poking up along the fence line. 2 months later, those seedlings had become a 12-foot-tall wall of yellow blocking the view from every house on that side of the development. The homeowners were furious. Property values were apparently suffering because nobody wanted to buy a house with a view of my agricultural eyesore. The HOA demanded I remove the sunflowers immediately. I politely reminded them that they'd specifically ordered me to remove inappropriate landscaping, which I'd done. The sunflowers were decorative plants, perfectly appropriate and entirely on my property. If they had a problem with them, they were welcome to file a complaint with the county. But the sunflowers were just the beginning. Remember that compliance order threatening to bring my property into compliance at my expense? Well, they'd made that threat in writing, and I had every intention of holding them to it. The next phase of my malicious compliance came when they tried to escalate their threats. The board president showed up at my door with a new document, something called a final notice of non-compliance, that gave me 72 hours to remove the sunflowers or face immediate remediation action. This document was even more detailed than the previous ones. It included specific language about how they would enter my property, remove the offensive vegetation, and bill me for the service. They'd even gotten quotes from landscaping companies. The whole thing was signed, notarized, and delivered with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for legal documents. I thanked them politely for the notice and told them I looked forward to their remediation action. What they didn't know was that I'd spent those 2 months doing research. I'd filed complaints with the county sheriff's office about their repeated trespassing, documented every interaction, and most importantly, I'd installed security cameras covering every inch of my property line. 73 hours later, a landscaping truck pulled into my driveway. 3 men with chainsaws and hedge trimmers got out and started walking toward my sunflowers. I met them at the property line with my sheriff's deputy friend in tow. The landscapers had a work order from the HOA authorizing them to remove unauthorized vegetation from my property. When the deputy explained they were about to commit criminal trespassing and destruction of property, they packed up and left pretty quickly. Apparently, the HOA hadn't bothered to mention that they didn't actually own my land. But here's where it gets good. The work order they'd left behind included all the details of their planned remediation. Not just removing my sunflowers, but also reseeding the area with approved ground cover and installing a decorative fence to maintain property values. The total cost they planned to bill me? $12,000. I took that work order straight to my lawyer, along with all their previous compliance orders and threats. Turns out, conspiracy to commit trespassing and property destruction is taken pretty seriously by the courts, especially when there's a paper trail showing premeditation. The legal demand letter my lawyer sent to the HOA was a thing of beauty. It outlined their repeated trespassing, their fraudulent claims of authority, and their documented threats to vandalize my property. It demanded they cease all contact with me and acknowledge in writing that they had no authority over my land. Their response was predictably arrogant. Their lawyer, and yes, they actually hired a lawyer rather than just admitting they were wrong, sent back a letter claiming they were simply enforcing community standards, and that my agricultural activities were negatively impacting property values. That's when I realized they still didn't understand the situation. They genuinely believed they could intimidate me into compliance through legal threats and bureaucratic pressure. So I decided to show them exactly what agricultural activities looked like. Remember, my property was zoned for agricultural use, had been since before their development existed. I had every right to farm my land however I saw fit. So I did. I started small with a few chickens in a coop near the property line. Chickens are perfectly legal on agricultural property, and the morning rooster calls added a lovely rural ambiance to the suburban paradise next door. When the HOA complained about the noise pollution, I added a few more roosters for good measure. Next came the goats, a small herd of perfectly legal, properly fenced dairy goats with a charming habit of bleating enthusiastically whenever they saw people walking by. The HOA residents trying to enjoy their backyard barbecues found the constant animal commentary somewhat less than relaxing. But the real masterpiece was the compost operation. Every farm needs good compost, and I happened to have connections with several local restaurants and groceries that were happy to let me haul away their organic waste. Nothing illegal or unsanitary, mind you. Just a properly managed composting system that happened to produce a certain agricultural aroma when the wind was blowing toward the development. The complaints started pouring into the county within a week. The HOA board president personally called the zoning office, the health department, and anyone else who would listen, demanding they shut down my illegal farming operation. Every inspection came back the same way. Everything was perfectly legal, properly permitted, and in full compliance with agricultural zoning regulations. The inspectors were actually impressed with how well managed everything was. Meanwhile, property values in Willowbrook Estates started dropping. Turns out potential home buyers weren't thrilled about the prospect of living next to an active farm, even a small one. The HOA's own real estate agent advised them that the agricultural activities were likely to continue as long as the property remained properly zoned. The final straw came when I expanded into what I called my educational farming initiative. I started offering tours of my operation to local school groups, complete with hands-on experiences feeding the animals and learning about sustainable agriculture. The kids loved it, and their parents appreciated having a local educational resource. Of course, those tours meant regular bus traffic on my gravel driveway, excited children's voices carrying across the property line, and educational signage explaining various aspects of farming life. The HOA residents found their peaceful suburban oasis had been transformed into something resembling a working farm with a petting zoo attached. After 6 months of declining property values, constant complaints, and legal bills that were mounting faster than their landscaping costs, the HOA finally capitulated. I received a formal letter of apology acknowledging that they had no authority over my property, along with a written agreement to cease all contact with me regarding any aspect of my land use. The board president was quietly forced to resign after homeowners realized her aggressive overreach had cost them hundreds of thousands in property value losses. The enforcement coordinator found himself out of a job when the community decided they didn't need someone quite so enthusiastic about exceeding his authority. As for me, I kept the sunflowers. They're perennials now and come back bigger every year. The chickens provide fresh eggs, the goats are excellent brush clearers, and the compost operation has turned my soil into something that would make any gardener jealous. The educational tours continue twice a month, and I've actually started making a small profit from the whole operation. The best part is that everything I did was completely legal and appropriate for my agriculturally zoned property. I simply gave them exactly what their threats and demands had forced me to consider: a fully operational farm that exercised every right I had as a property owner. Sometimes malicious compliance isn't just about following orders to the letter. Sometimes it's about showing people exactly what they're asking for when they try to overstep their authority. The HOA learned that lesson the expensive way, and I got a thriving agricultural operation out of the deal. These days, my property line is clearly marked with no trespassing signs, and nobody from Willowbrook Estates has set foot on my land without permission. Funny how a little legal farming can solve a boundary dispute better than any lawyer ever could. Anyway, thank you for